3 signatures, $42 million in redirected company assets, and one quiet, desperate sob echoing through the mahogany hallway of the 48th floor. That was what it came down to. And what I did in the 60 seconds after I dropped my keys outside that locked office door was the one single action nobody in that glass and steel tower saw coming. I broke the silence. I shattered his carefully constructed illusion. I'll tell you exactly how I dismantled his entire life in just a minute. But first, if you have ever been the person in the room that everyone looked through instead of at, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is for you. Now let me tell you why a man in a grease-stained Peterbilt jacket had a master access card to the most secure boardroom in the city. The engine of the 2019 Kenworth vibrated up through the soles of my boots. I had checked the tyre pressure on all 18 wheels. I had recorded the axle weights on the clipboard. Marcus leaned against the rolling steel door. He held a thermos in both hands. "You're running the Seattle route again?" Marcus asked. He did not look at me. He looked at the frost forming on the chain link fence. "They cut the overtime pay," Marcus said. His voice was flat, the kind of flat that comes from a man who has already done the math on his mortgage. "Memo came down yesterday. Management says it's an efficiency restructuring." I stopped with my hand on the chrome door handle. "Which management?" "The new VP, the CEO's husband, David." Marcus spat the name into the snow. "He's making changes." I filed that name away behind my eyes. I had known David for 6 years. I had paid for the ice sculptors at his wedding. I had watched him swear to protect my daughter, Sarah. I climbed into the cab. The leather seat was worn on the left side, exactly where I slid in every morning. I didn't tell Marcus that I owned the trucks. I didn't tell him I owned the loading bay, the steel doors, and the 48-story tower that cast a shadow over us. I had handed the CEO title to Sarah 3 years ago. I kept a single truck for myself. It kept me honest. It kept me invisible. But invisibility without vigilance isn't peace. It's a blindfold. The rain started just past the county line. I kept the wipers on the lowest setting. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. The caller ID glowed green. Sarah. I let it ring twice. I picked it up on the third. "Dispatch." "Dad?" Her voice was thin. It sounded like paper tearing. "David wants to sell the Seattle hub," she said. The words came out too fast, rushed. "He brought a buyer to the board meeting yesterday. He says we're bleeding capital." I gripped the steering wheel. The lever creaked under my knuckles. "The Seattle hub handles 40% of our coastal freight. We aren't bleeding capital, Sarah." "He showed me the ledgers, Dad." "The numbers?" She drew in a shaky breath. It was a small sound, but it filled the cabin of my truck. "I don't know what I'm looking at anymore." "Sarah, look at me." "I'm on the phone, Dad." "Look at the phone. Listen to my voice." I waited until the breathing on the other end leveled out. "Do not sign anything today. Do you hear me? The board is voting at noon. I said, do not sign." I downshifted. The engine roared, a deep, guttural sound of resistance. "I am turning the truck around." "Dad, you can't just walk into the boardroom in your work boots. They don't know who you are." "David thinks you're just an old driver I keep on the payroll out of pity." I know what David thinks. I signaled for the next exit. "I'll see you at noon." I hung up. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I had let my daughter run the company because she was brilliant. She had the mind for it. But David had the ambition. And ambition is the enemy of loyalty. I took the exit ramp at 45 miles an hour. The cargo in the trailer shifted. I didn't care. The marble floors of the Harrison Logistics Tower gleamed under the recessed lighting. I stepped through the revolving glass doors. My boots left wet, heavy footprints on the stone. The security guard at the front desk was new. He wore a crisp blue uniform. His name tag read Benson. He held up a hand as I approached the elevators. "Hey, delivery goes around to the back. Freight elevator." I stopped 2 feet away. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn jacket. I pulled out a solid black key card. No logo, no name, just a magnetic strip. I tapped it against the scanner next to the private elevator. The machine beeped once, a soft, clear chime. The heavy steel doors slid open immediately. "Have a good morning, Benson," I said. I stepped inside. I hit the button for the 48th floor. I watched the numbers climb. 12, 24, 36. With every floor, the temperature in the elevator seemed to drop. Or maybe it was just me. By the time the doors opened on the 48th floor, I wasn't just a truck driver coming to check on his daughter. I was the founder coming to reclaim his house. And that was when I heard it. The sound that changed everything. The sobbing came from the CEO suite, room 4801. It was not loud. It was the sound of someone who had been holding their breath for 3 years and had finally run out of air. I stood outside the frosted glass. I could see the silhouette of my daughter. She was not sitting in the executive leather chair I had bought for her. She was sitting on the floor. The shadows of open ledger binders surrounded her like a barricade. A father's first instinct is to pull his child from the fire. A founder's instinct is to find the person who struck the match. I did not go in. I stepped away from her door and walked 20 feet down the corridor. Room 4802. Vice President of Operations. The heavy oak door was cracked open 2 inches. David was inside. He was not looking at ledgers. He was pouring a glass of Macallan 18. I knew the bottle because I'd sent it to him for his birthday. No, the old man doesn't know a thing, David said. He had his phone pressed to his ear. He drives a rig up to Seattle, thinks the company runs on diesel and elbow grease. He took a sip of the scotch. He checked his reflection in the window overlooking the city. The buyer is ready, David continued. As soon as Sarah signs the divestment papers at noon, the Seattle hub is gone. We route 30% of the sale price into the Cayman LLC as consulting fees. She'll never see it. She's too busy crying over the operational losses I fabricated. I watched the ice clink against the glass in his hand. I remembered the day he asked for Sarah's hand in marriage. We had been standing in my driveway. He had looked me in the eye and promised to be her anchor. Promises without sacrifice aren't promises. They're just negotiations. I'll see you in the boardroom, Elena, David said. He ended the call. Elena. The chief legal counsel, the woman who had drawn up Sarah's executive contract. I backed away from the door. I did not confront him in the office. A man who builds a trap should be allowed to walk all the way into it before you spring the lock. David stepped out of his office down the hall. He carried a stack of black leather folders. He walked with the crisp, hurried stride of a man who believes he is the smartest person in the building. He saw me. He stopped. The smile he wore for the board members vanished. He looked at my jacket. He looked at my hands. What are you doing up here, Arthur? David asked. He did not lower his voice. He wanted the board members to hear. I came to see my daughter, I said. Sarah is preparing for an executive vote. She doesn't have time to hold your hand. David adjusted his silk tie. If you need a route assignment, go down to dispatch. If you need an advance on your paycheck, fill out the form in HR. I don't need a route, I said, and I don't need an advance. I need to look at the divestment papers. David laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. You want to look at the corporate divestment strategy? You drive a truck, Arthur. You move boxes from point A to point B. The math in those folders has commas in places you haven't seen since grade school. I looked at the folder in his hand. The tab on the side read Annexure B, Asset Liquidation. Does Annexure B include the property deeds for the Seattle dock, or just the fleet assets? I asked. David's eyes snapped to mine. The colour drained from his cheeks for a fraction of a second, just a flicker, but I caught it. He recovered quickly. He stepped into my space. I don't know where you heard that term, old man, but this is a closed meeting. You need to leave. Now, before I call Benson from the lobby. Benson is on his lunch break, I said. He takes it at 11:45. David pointed a finger at my chest. He did not touch me. He knew better. You are embarrassing your daughter. Go wait in your truck. I'll have her call you when the adults are finished. Subscribe right now because the next part of this story is the part that changes everything. He turned his back on me and walked into the boardroom. I did not go to my truck. I walked to room 4801. I pushed the door open without knocking. Sarah looked up. Her eyes were red. Her makeup was smudged along her lower lashes. She scrambled to close the binders on the floor. Dad, she whispered, you can't be in here. Leave the binders, I said. I walked over to her desk. I picked up the silver pen sitting next to the framed photo of the two of us. The photo was taken the day we bought the first warehouse. We were both covered in dust. We were smiling. David said we're bankrupt, Dad. He said if I don't sign the sale of the Seattle hub today, the banks will call our loans by Friday. She stood up. Her hands were shaking. I failed. I lost the company. He didn't lose anything, I said. I placed the silver pen in my inner pocket. He hid the margins. He routed the operating capital into a ghost ledger. He created a crisis so you would hand him the keys to the lifeboats. Sarah stared at me. The confusion in her eyes was heavy. How do you know that? Because I built the ship. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12. It's noon. Wipe your face, Sarah. The air in the boardroom smelled of lemon polish and expensive cologne. 12 men and women sat around the 20-foot mahogany table. David stood at the head, a silver projector remote in his right hand. Elena, the chief legal counsel, sat to his left. The divestment contracts were open in front of her. The heavy doors clicked shut behind us. The room went dead silent. David's practiced smile collapsed. Sarah, you're late. And you brought, he gestured toward me, his hand waving as if brushing away a stray dog. Please ask your father to wait in the lobby. This is a closed executive vote. He stays, Sarah said. Her voice trembled, but she did not step. Sarah, this is a board of directors meeting, Elena said smoothly. She tapped a gold pen against the contract. Non-shareholders and non-executives cannot be present during a binding financial vote. It's a breach of confidentiality. I walked past my daughter. I walked past the first 3 board members. They pulled their chairs in slightly, making sure my grease-stained jacket did not brush against their tailored wool. I stopped at the empty leather chair at the opposite end of the table, the founder's chair. It had been left empty at every meeting for 3 years out of tradition. I pulled it out. The casters rolled smoothly over the carpet. I sat down. David placed his hands flat on the table. He leaned forward. Get up, now, or I am calling security to physically remove you. Corporate Bylaw, Article 4, Section 2A, I said. I rested my forearms on the polished mahogany. Any silent partner holding more than 51% of Class A voting stock retains the immediate right to audit, attend, and veto any asset liquidation exceeding $10 million. That bylaw only applies to the primary founder's equity. The founder's shares were legally transferred to Sarah 3 years ago, Elena said. Were they? I asked. I looked at David. I watched his eyes dart to Elena, then to the contract, then back to me. The rigid confidence in his posture suddenly looked brittle. Sarah is the CEO, David said loudly. His voice cracked slightly on the last syllable. She holds the operational equity. Hand her the pen, Elena. Elena slid the thick stack of papers and the gold pen to the edge of the table, right in front of Sarah. Sign it, honey, David said. His tone shifted instantly. He used the soft, reassuring cadence he always used when he wanted something. We need this capital injection to survive the quarter. I'm trying to save your legacy. Just sign the transfer and the bleeding stops today. Sarah looked down at the gold pen. Her fingers hovered over it. The weight of the room pressed down on her. I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders. The desperate desire for the pressure to just end. A legacy without truth isn't a legacy, I said quietly. The words echoing the lesson I had taught her when she was 12 years old, standing in a dusty warehouse. It's just a heavily insured lie. I reached into my pocket. I slid the silver pen I had taken from her desk across the long table. It spun in a slow, perfect arc, stopping precisely against the edge of the contract. Read page 12, paragraph 4, Sarah, I said, before you sign away our house. Sarah's fingers trembled as she pulled the thick stack of papers closer. She flipped past the executive summaries, past the operational indexes. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a steel wire about to snap. Sarah, you don't need to read the legal boilerplate, David said. He took a step toward her. His voice was no longer soft, it was edged with panic. She found page 12. Her eyes tracked down to the 4th paragraph. I didn't need to read it. I had memorized the document at 5 a.m. while drinking black coffee in the cab of my truck. The clause redirected $42 million of the sale, labelled as administrative severance, directly into a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company named D&E Holdings. David and Elena. Watching her read it was the hardest thing I had ever done. It was worse than working 70-hour weeks. It was worse than the cold nights on the dock. The only sound in the room had been the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the rhythmic, tired beep of the heart monitor. My wife, Margaret, held my hand. Her skin was thin, bruised purple from the IV lines, like wet tissue paper. You built an empire, Artie, she whispered. Her breath rattled in her chest. But empires crush the people living inside them. I had squeezed her hand. I couldn't speak. The grief in my throat was a jagged, heavy stone. Step back, she told me, her eyes clouded but fierce. Give Sarah the title. Let her run it, but you go back to the floor. Go back to the trucks. She stopped to cough, a dry, painful sound. People only show their true faces to the invisible men. Watch the people around her. Protect her from the seats. A single tear tracked down her pale cheek, slipping into her hairline. A throne without a shield is just a target. Be her shield. I blinked. The memory of the hospital room faded, leaving behind the stark, cold reality of the boardroom. A hot, quiet tear finally escaped my eye and ran down my weathered face. I did not wipe it away. I let it fall. I was mourning Margaret all over again, and I was mourning the profound heartbreak my daughter was enduring in this very second. Sarah looked up from the contract. The exhaustion in her shoulders had vanished. It was replaced by a cold, devastating clarity. She looked at Elena. Then she looked at the man she had married. D&E Holdings, Sarah read aloud. The words fell like lead weights on the polished mahogany. David and Elena. $42 million in operational consulting fees. David's jaw locked. He looked at the 12 board members. They were staring at him, their expressions morphing from annoyance to sheer legal terror. It's a tax mitigation strategy, David stammered. The flawless veneer was gone, exposing the frantic scrambling underneath. Sarah, you don't understand the tax implications of a direct corporate sale. Sarah slowly picked up the gold pen. I understand perfectly, she said. Sarah did not sign the document. She placed the tip of the gold pen on the mahogany table and pressed down until the expensive nib snapped in half. The sharp crack echoed against the glass walls. You're done, David, Sarah said. She did not yell. She sounded like a woman who had just put down a very heavy box. Both of you, pack your office. David let out a harsh, frantic laugh. The sound grated against the quiet room. You can't fire me, Sarah. It requires a board majority to remove a C-suite executive. Elena, explain the corporate bylaws to her. Elena did not speak. She was staring down at her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently that the device rattled against the table. The screen was lit up with a rapid succession of automated banking alerts. I wouldn't bother checking the offshore accounts, Elena, I said. I stood up from the founder's chair. I pulled a folded legal document from my jacket pocket and dropped it next to the broken pen. I called the Federal Fraud Division at 6:14 this morning. The Cayman ledgers were frozen by David's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He slammed both hands onto the table, leaning toward me. You're a truck driver! You don't have the clearance to authorize a federal hold on corporate accounts. He doesn't, a voice said from the far right of the table. It was Sterling, the oldest member of the board. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and looked at David with profound, quiet distaste. But Arthur Harrison, the sole owner of 62% of this company's voting stock, certainly does. David froze. The blood drained from his face just as quickly as it had arrived. He looked at the grease stains on my jacket. He looked at the heavy work boots. Then he looked at my eyes. I stood 2 feet away, and I watched him process the information. I watched the sheer, crushing weight of understanding hit him as he realized exactly who he had tried to rob and exactly whose daughter he had tried to break. I told you I didn't need a route, David, I said. I buttoned my jacket. I own the roads. Security escorted David and Elena out of the building in handcuffs. Sarah took the elevator back up to the 48th floor, holding the real ledgers. She wasn't crying anymore. Trust without verification isn't trust. It's surrender. I climbed back into the cab of my Kenworth and started the heavy diesel engine. The company was safe. Drop a like if this one hit different. Leave your story in the comments. I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next one.